programs and policy for the next 2 years. Senators are expected to vote at 11 o'clock this morning related to an amendment by Senator Roy Blunt allowing employers and other insurance providers to decline coverage of care that they have a moral objection to. The senator's office calls the amendment the Respect for Rights of the Conscience Act. And now to live coverage of the Senate here on C-SPAN 2.
The Senate will come to order. The chaplain, Dr. Barry Black, will lead the Senate in prayer.
Let us pray. Eternal Lord God, who rules the raging of the sea, thank you for the gift of freedom. We're grateful for a nation where we can speak, vote, and worship as we wish. May we never take liberty's blessings for granted, but remember our accountability to you to be responsible in our thoughts, words, and actions. Use our senators to preserve our freedoms. Let integrity be the hallmark of their characters, individually and corporately. Fill their hearts with your unalterable, undiminishing, and unending love. We pray in your merciful name. Amen.
Please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance to our flag. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. The clerk will read a communication to the Senate.
Washington, D.C., March 1st, 2012. To the Senate, under the provisions of Rule 1, Paragraph 3 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, I hereby appoint the Honorable Tom Udall, a senator from the state of New Mexico, to perform the duties of the chair. Signed, Daniel K. Inouye, President pro tempore.
President.
The Majority Leader.
Following leader remarks, the Senate will resume consideration of the Surface Transportation Bill. As I indicated last night, I now ask consent, unanimous consent, that there be 90 minutes of debate equally divided and controlled prior to the vote and duration of the Blunt Amendment. All other provisions of the previous order remain in effect, and that the time that...
Without objection.
Well, Mr. President, and the time that Senator McConnell and I use prior to the vote not count against the 90 minutes.
Without objection.
So the vote will be somewhat after 11 o'clock, but it shouldn't be long after 11 o'clock. We hope that when we get rid of this amendment that we'll be able to make an agreement with the Republicans to move forward on this bill. We've been unsuccessful in doing that to this point. Mr. President, too often, cooperation is in short supply here in the Senate. So I was pleased when we began consideration of a truly bipartisan jobs bill. As I've said here a number of times the past week or so, if there were ever a bipartisan bill, this is it. Progressive Barbara Boxer, conservative Jim Inhofe, they've agreed on a way to move forward on a bill that will save 1.8 million jobs and create about 1 million more jobs. So this would put millions of people to work right away. Although our economy has gained momentum, there are still millions of Americans out of work. So it should be obvious why we can't afford to delay efforts to rebuild our roadways, our railways, and our bridges. Almost 1,000 organizations, including business groups and labor unions that rarely see eye to eye on anything, support this common sense measure. More than 30 of those groups, including the United States Chamber of Commerce and the American Automobile Association, AAA, have asked senators to refrain from offering unrelated ideological amendments to this bill. As I said, Mr. President, almost 1,000 organizations want this done. Here's what the U.S. Chamber and AAA wrote recently, and I quote, "The organizations that we represent may hold diverse views on social, energy, and fiscal issues, but we are united in our desire to see immediate action on the Senate's bipartisan highway and transit reauthorization measures," close quotes. We started on this piece of legislation on February 7th. It's the first day of March now. These groups don't agree on much, but they do agree that this legislation is too important to be bogged down with political amendments. So they spoke as one. There was a time when this kind of cooperation was a standard in the Senate. There was a time when two senators who had little in common could still share common purpose. There was a time when groups of senators divided by political party could still be united in their desire to pass worthy legislation. One senator who has always exemplified that willingness to set aside philosophical and political differences and work together is my friend, the senior senator from Maine, Olympia Snowe. I've always appreciated Senator Snow's ability to look at every side of an issue with a practical eye and not a political eye. Her courage, common sense, and moderation will be missed here in the United States Senate. Over the last 15 years, I've had the pleasure of working many times with Senator Snowe on an issue now at the forefront of this debate, both across the nation and on the Senate floor. Beginning in 1997, we worked together to increase women's access to contraception and to make sure insurance companies treated contraceptives like other prescription medications. There are plenty of things Senator Snowe and I disagree, lots of things. But by finding common ground, we improved women's health and reduced unintended pregnancies, something we should all agree on. And there's no question that it was accomplished by what we did legislatively. Unfortunately, the bipartisan progress Senator Snowe and I made over the years is now under attack. Today, the Senate will vote on an extreme ideological amendment to the bipartisan transportation bill. This amendment takes aim at women's access to health care. It will allow any employer or insurer to deny coverage for virtually any treatment for virtually any reason. I repeat, it will allow any employer or insurer to deny coverage for virtually any treatment for virtually any reason. I was pleased to hear that Senator Snowe intends to oppose this measure. I read that last night. Although the amendment was designed to restrict women's access to contraception, it would also limit all Americans' access to essential health care. Here are just a few of the life-saving treatments employers could deny if this amendment passes. Hard to comprehend, but here's what some of them would be. Mammograms and other cancer screenings, prenatal care, flu shots, diabetes screenings, childhood vaccinations. To make matters worse, Republicans held up progress on an important jobs bill to extract this political vote. As the economy is finally moving forward a little bit, Republicans have tried to force Congress to take its foot off the gas. Every member of this body knows the Blunt Amendment has nothing to do with highways or bridges or trains or train tracks. This amendment has no place on a transportation bill. But with 2 million jobs at stake, the Senate cannot afford to delay progress on a job-creating measure any longer. So Democrats have agreed to vote on Senator Blunt's amendment so we can hopefully move on. Once the Senate disposes of this partisan political amendment, I hope we'll be able to resume in earnest bipartisan work on a transportation bill.
Mr. President,
Republican leaders recognized.
I've spent a lot of time in my Senate career defending the First Amendment. Most of that time I focused on the part that deals with free speech. But recent actions by the Obama administration related to the president's health care law have prompted many of us here and many across the country to stand up in defense of another freedom that's covered in the First Amendment, and that's religious freedom. Now, let me just say at the outset that most of us didn't expect that we'd ever have to defend this right in a body which every one of us is sworn to uphold and defend the U.S. Constitution. Most of us probably assumed that if religious liberty were ever seriously challenged in this country, we could always expect a robust bipartisan defense of it, at least from within the Congress itself. But unfortunately, that's not the situation we find ourselves in. Democrats have evidently decided they'd rather defend a president of their own party, regardless of the impact of his policies. So rather than defend the First Amendment, in this particular case, they've decided to engage in a campaign of distraction as a way of obscuring the larger issue which is at stake here. And if Democrats no longer see the value in defending the First Amendment because they don't think it's politically expedient to do so, or because they want to protect the president, then Republicans will have to do it for them. And we're happy to do that, because this is an issue that's greater than any short-term political gain. It gets right at the heart of who we are as a people, and we welcome the opportunity to affirm what this country is all about. What makes America unique in the world is the fact that it was established on the basis of an idea, the idea that all of us have been endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights. In other words, rights that are conferred not by a king or a president, or certainly a Congress, but by the Creator himself. The state protects these rights, but it does not grant them. And what the state doesn't grant, the state can't take away. Now, the first of these rights, according to the men who wrote the U.S. Constitution, is the right to have one's religious beliefs protected from government interference. The First Amendment couldn't be clearer on this point. The government can neither establish religion nor can it prevent its free exercise. And if the free exercise of religion clause of the First Amendment means anything at all, it means that it is not within the power of the federal government to tell anybody what to believe or to punish them for practicing those beliefs. And yet that's precisely what the Obama administration is trying to do through the president's health care law. We all remember then Speaker Pelosi saying that we'd have to pass the health care bill to find out what was in it. Well, this is one of the things we've found, that it empowers bureaucrats here in Washington to decide which tenets religious institutions can and can't adhere to. If they don't get in line, they'll be penalized. According to congressional testimony delivered this week by Usma Udin of the Beckett Fund for Religious Liberty, this is not only unprecedented in federal law, but broader in scope and narrower in its exemption than the 28 state mandates that some have pointed to in the administration's defense. Moreover, even in states with strictest mandates, religious institutions can still either opt out of state-level mandate or self-insure. But if they try that now, they run into this new federal mandate, making it impossible for the first time for religious institutions to avoid punishment for practicing what they preach. Now some of the proponents of this mandate say that in this case, we should just ignore the First Amendment. That's what the proponents are saying. In this particular instance, just ignore the First Amendment. They say that certain religious beliefs in question aren't particularly popular, so they don't really deserve First Amendment protection. But isn't that the entire point of the First Amendment? To protect rights regardless of who or how many people hold them. Isn't that the reason people came to this country in the first place? As a refuge from governments that said they had to toe the majority line. Some of the proponents of this mandate have also said they're willing to offer a so-called compromise that would respect what they call the core mission of religious institutions. But here's the catch. They want to be the ones to tell these religious institutions what their core mission is. The government telling the religious institution what the core mission is. That isn't a compromise. That's another government takeover. Only this time it isn't the banks or the car companies. It's religion. I mean, who do you think has a better grasp of the mission of the Catholic Church? The Cardinal Archbishop of New York or the President's campaign manager? Who are you going to listen to on the question of whether this mandate violates freedom of religion? The president of one of the largest seminaries on the planet, or Albert Mohler, Jr., or some bureaucrat in Washington? The question answers itself. Look, this is precisely the kind of thing the founders feared. It was precisely because of the danger of a government intrusion into religion like this one that they left us the First Amendment in the first place, so that we could always point to it and say, no government, no president has that right. Religious institutions are free to decide what they believe, and the government must respect their right to do so. And remember, as many of us said during the debate on the President's health care bill, this is just the beginning. If the government is allowed to compel people to buy health care, it won't stop there. Now it's telling people what their religious beliefs are and what their religious practices ought to be. Well, I wonder what's next. Let's be clear, this isn't about one particular religion. It's about the right of Americans of any religion to live out their faith without the government picking and choosing which doctrines they're allowed to follow. When one religion is threatened, all religions are threatened. And allowing this particular infringement would surely ease the way for others. This is something my constituents understood immediately in this debate. I've received a lot of letters from religious leaders and concerned citizens who know that an attack on the beliefs of one religion is an attack on the beliefs of any religion. And many of them make the case a lot better than I can. So I'd like to just share for a moment some thoughts from my constituents on this issue. I'll start with the Catholic Archbishop of Louisville, Archbishop Joseph Kurtz. Here's what he wrote. The federal government, which claims to be of, by, and for the people, has just dealt a heavy blow to almost a quarter of those people, the Catholic population, and to the millions more who are served by the Catholic faithful. In so ruling, the administration has cast aside the First Amendment to the Constitution of the United States, denying to Catholics our nation's first and most fundamental freedom, that of religious liberty. We cannot, we will not comply with this unjust law. People of faith cannot be made second-class citizens. Here's what Bishop Ronald Gaynor of the Catholic Diocese of Lexington had to say. Civil law and civil structures should recognize and protect the Church's right and obligation to participate in society without expecting us or forcing us to abandon or compromise our fundamental moral convictions. If we have an obligation to teach and give eyewitness to moral values that should shape our lives and inspire our society, then there is a corresponding obligation that we be allowed to follow and express freely those religious values. Anything short of government protection of that freedom represents an unwarranted threat of government interference. Here's the president of the University of the Cumberlands, Jim Taylor. The intrusion of the administration into the right of the free exercise of religion is disappointing. The choice to interfere with religious hospitals, charities, and schools with a mandate violating their religious views is disconcerting and will in all probability be totally counterproductive, further polarizing this nation. And finally, I want to read a letter from Dr. R. Albert Mohler, Jr. I mentioned him earlier. He's the president of the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, the flagship school of the Southern Baptist Convention and one of the largest seminaries in the world. I'm going to quote it in full, and then I'd like to submit it for the record. Here's what Dr. Moeller had to say. I write to express my deepest concern regarding the recent policy announced by the Department of Health and Human Services that will require religious institutions to provide mandated contraceptive and anti-abortion services to employees. This policy, announced by Secretary Sebelius, tramples on the religious liberty of American Christians, who are now informed that our colleges, schools, hospitals, and other service organizations must violate conscience in order to comply with the Affordable Care Act. This exemption announced by the Obama administration is so intentionally narrow that it will cover only congregations and religious institutions that employ and serve only members of our own faiths. This exemption deliberately excludes Christian institutions that have served this nation and its people through education, social services, and health care. The new policy effectively tells Christian institutions that if we want to remain true to our convictions and our consciences, we will have to cease serving the public. This is a policy that will either require millions upon millions of Americans to accept a gross and deliberate violation of religious liberty, or to accept the total secularization of all education and social services. Christians of conscience are now informed by our own government that we must violate our convictions on a matter of grave theological and moral significance. This is not a Catholic issue. The inclusion of abortion forms of birth control, such as emergency contraceptives, will violate the deepest beliefs of millions upon millions of Christians, along with Americans of other faiths who share these convictions. The religious objections to this policy are rooted in centuries of teaching, belief, and moral instruction. He goes on. This policy is an outrage that violates our deepest constitutional principles and tramples religious liberty under the feet of deliberate government policy. As many religious leaders have already indicated, we cannot comply with this policy. The one-year extension offered by the Obama administration is a further insult, providing a year in which we are, by government mandate, to prepare to sacrifice our religious liberties and violate conscience. I, along with millions of other Americans, humbly request that the Congress of the United States provide an immediate and effective remedy to this intolerable violation of religious liberty. Please do not allow this abominable policy to stand. Protection of our most basic and fundamental liberties now rests in your hands. So, Mr. President, I'll conclude with this. If there's one good thing about this debate, it's that it's given us all an opportunity to reaffirm what we believe as Americans. It gives us an opportunity to stand together and to say, this is what we're all about. This is what makes America unique. This is what makes it great. That's why I'll be voting for the Blunt amendment. And that's why it's my sincere hope that the President and those in his administration come around to this view, too. That they come to realize from the outpouring we've seen over the past several weeks from across the country that the free and diverse exercise of religion in this country has always been one of our nation's greatest assets. And one of the things that truly sets us apart. As I said at the outset of this debate, I hope the President reconsiders this deeply misguided policy and reverses it. It crosses a dangerous line. It must be reversed, but if he doesn't, either Congress or the courts will surely act. Now, Mr. President, I want to address one other matter related to my home state. We've had severe storms and tornadoes that cut through parts of the Midwest yesterday, including hitting my state of Kentucky. People across the Bluegrass State are still recovering this morning from considerable damage caused by very severe weather. The National Weather Service has confirmed 4 tornadoes struck in Kentucky with winds of up to 125 miles per hour. These funnel clouds were sighted in Elizabethtown, eastern Grayson County, LaRue County, and near downtown Hodgenville, which, interestingly enough, is the home of Abraham Lincoln's birthplace. In all, the National Weather Service has confirmed at least 16 tornadoes across the country through 7 states: Nebraska, Kansas, Missouri, Illinois, Tennessee, Indiana, and Kentucky. Over 300 reports of severe weather across the region describe frightening details, such as wind gusts of over 80 miles an hour and golf-sized hailstorms. There were reports of power outages for thousands of people across Kentucky, particularly in my hometown of Louisville, the towns of Elizabethtown and Paducah, and in Muhlenberg and Grayson counties. Downed power lines, flash flooding were reported all across the state. News and reports and accounts from my own staff tell me there has been considerable damage across Kentucky, including dozens of homes and businesses damaged and several people injured. 2 people in McCracken County near Paducah were rescued from an overturned mobile home and rushed to the hospital in critical condition. From what we know at this point, however, thankfully it appears no lives were lost in Kentucky. Unfortunately, the same cannot be said elsewhere, as the severe weather that raged through 6 other states has reportedly claimed at least 12 lives. I would join my colleagues from the affected states in keeping in my thoughts today all those affected by these storms, especially the families of those lost in these tragic and unforeseen circumstances. I also want to extend my gratitude to the first responders in Kentucky and across the entire Midwest who have risen to the occasion and provided the much-needed response and relief. Let me particularly thank the Kentucky National Guard, which is there to assist, as always, when disaster strikes. Authorities are warning us that the threat from severe weather is not over. More storms are expected today in Alabama, Tennessee, and again in Kentucky. We'll continue to keep a close eye on Kentucky and other states in the affected region and make sure people have everything they need to clean up, rebuild, and reclaim their dignity from the wreckage of this tragedy. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Without objection, the letter read by the Republican leader will be submitted to the record. Under the previous order, the leadership time is reserved. Under the previous order, the Senate will resume consideration of S. 1813, which the clerk will report.
Calendar number 311, S. 1813, a bill to reauthorize federal aid highway and highway safety construction programs and for other purposes.
Under the previous order, there will now be 90 minutes equally divided and controlled between the 2 leaders and their designees.
President.
Senator from Louisiana is recognized.
Mr. President, I rise in strong, passionate support of the Blunt Amendment, very important amendment which we'll be voting on as an entire U.S. Senate at 11 a.m. this morning. The Blunt Amendment is an absolutely necessary measure to fix what is a very egregious overstepping of the bounds of government in terms of the newly articulated Obamacare mandate on religion. As we all know through the debate and discussion of the last several weeks, the Obama administration has made it clear that everyone, including persons of faith, including religious institutions, are not only going to be forced to buy a product in the marketplace, and many of us think that itself is unprecedented and unconstitutional, but it gets worse because they will be forced to buy a product in the marketplace that violates their conscience, that violates their core beliefs. Catholics, many other Christians, many people of faith do not believe in certain activity and treatment that is mandated now to be covered by this mandatory insurance. And that is crossing a line that we have never before crossed in this country in terms of government power, government mandates, and government intrusion into the conscience of others, into the free exercise of religion. We absolutely need to fix this. Mr. President, this is a fundamental conscience issue. This is a freedom of religion issue, and that's exactly why it's so important. And let me also clarify, Mr. President, this isn't merely about contraception. Folks on the other side of the debate and most of the media constantly puts it merely in those terms. Well, first of all, those measures in and of themselves violate the conscience of many Americans. But secondly, it's not just about that. It's about abortion. It's about abortion-inducing drugs like Plan B. It's about sterilization. Now, clearly, these measures, clearly the government mandating Americans to buy, to pay for, to subsidize these measures violate the conscience of tens and tens today, starting today by passing the Blunt Amendment. Now, Mr. President, the arguments made on the other side, when you look at them carefully, just don't hold water. First of all, there's President Obama's so-called accommodation, so-called compromise, which isn't an accommodation and isn't a meaningful compromise at all. What did he say? He said, okay, we're not going to make Americans, persons of faith, religious institutions, buy coverage that they have moral qualms with. We're merely going to make the insurance provider provide that coverage, whether the customer wants it or not. Well, Mr. President, that is a completely superficial, completely meaningless word game. The insurer is providing this. How? What payment is supporting it? The only payment the insurer is getting is from the customer who objects to the coverage. So who's supporting it? Who's paying for it? Clearly, this is just a word game. If it weren't clear enough for the typical person or institution involved, what about institutions, and there are many of them, which are self-insured? What about, say, the University of Notre Dame, Catholic university, Catholic institution? It doesn't go to an insurance company to buy insurance. It's self-insured. So that word game doesn't even work on the surface there. And those cases number in the hundreds or thousands around the country. And that is a clear example of how that so-called compromise or accommodation is merely a sleight of hand and a word game. Another argument which the other side has made in this debate, Mr. President, is that somehow correcting this situation through the Blunt Amendment or through similar measures will shut down access to these services. That's just patently not true. These services, these medicines and other treatments are widely available in every community across the country at little cost or no cost for folks who can't afford it. And that's not going to change. It's absolutely not necessary to tear away religious liberty, violate conscience rights of millions of Americans with that argument in mind. Just isn't true. That's why, Mr. President, respected religious leaders like Cardinal Designate Timothy Nolan, President of the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, have argued strenuously, passionately against this mandate. Cardinal Designate Nolan has said, quote, "Never before has the federal government forced individuals and organizations to go out into the marketplace and buy a product that violates their conscience. This shouldn't happen in a land where free exercise of religion ranks first in the Bill of Rights," close quote. And so, Mr. President, that's what it comes down to. Free exercise of religion, fundamental conscience protection. The First Amendment to the Constitution, the first item in the Bill of Rights. It doesn't get much headier or more significant than that. And that is what this is all about. And again, it's all about, yes, contraception, but abortion, abortion-inducing pills like Plan B, and sterilization. Mr. President, please assure me that the free exercise of religion is not now a partisan issue. Please assure me that we're going to correct this situation and not allow this egregious overstepping of the bounds of the power of government. We must act to stop this grave injustice. and I hope we start that process in a very serious way today by voting positively by passing the Blunt Amendment. Thank you, Mr. President.
The senator from New Jersey is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. We're engaged in the business of the Senate, and it's not always discernible that it's the business of the people. When we see what's taking place these days, a principal mantra of Republicans on the campaign trail is that they seek more freedom for the American people. The Republicans like to say they don't want government interfering in people's lives. Then I ask, why the devil we are debating a Republican amendment that limits a woman's freedom to make her own health care choices? With women, the Republicans have a different idea about freedom. They want the government to interfere in the most personal aspects of women's lives. The amendment offered by the senator from Missouri, the Blunt Amendment it's called, will allow a woman's employer to deny coverage for any medical service that they, the employer, has a moral problem with. Imagine that. Your boss is going to decide whether or not you're acting morally. The Republicans want to take us forward to the dark ages again. And when women were property that you could easily control, trade even if you wanted to. Mr. President, it's appalling that we're having this debate in the 21st century. Yesterday, we heard something astounding. It came from Rush Limbaugh, who's a prime voice of modern conservatism in this country. What he said yesterday, and I had it checked because I wanted to be sure that I'm not misquoting anything, said, a woman who wants affordable birth control is, and I quote him here, a prostitute. Talking about your wife, your sister, your daughter, your child. Hateful, ugly language, and we condemn it. Republicans like to talk about the Constitution and freedom. But once again, when it comes to women, they don't get rights. They get restrictions. This foul amendment before us tells women that you can't be trusted to make your own health care decisions. Your employer may judge if your actions are moral. More than 20 million people, women in America, including more than 600,000 in my home state of New Jersey, could lose access to the health care services they need under this scheme. The Republican attack on women is not just happening here in Congress. It's happening on the presidential campaign trail. And I show you here what one of the two leading Republican presidential candidates has to say about birth control. He says, I can read it here, I'm not a believer in birth control, says Senator Santorum. I don't think it works. I think it's harmful to women. I think it's harmful to our society. And that's the kind of judgment that they want to put in employers' hands? Outrageous. Imagine that in a presidential contest, dismissing the kinds of things that millions and millions of women rely upon to protect their health, to keep them from unwanted pregnancies, but to keep them from disease, to keep them from all kinds of things that can make life difficult. And so, women of America, former Senator Santorum, and Republicans here, it almost requires a tap on the head. Don't worry. We know what's best for you. I want to be clear. Rick Santorum does not have a physician's training. He is a politician. And when we look out in polls across the country, we see what the people in our society are thinking about politicians these days. It's time for Senator Santorum and his fellow Republicans to mind their business. Let's get on with the needs of the country, put people back to work, give them health care, let them have an education. No, we're going to spend time here keeping people from going to work. There are thousands of jobs that are at stake on the legislation that is in front of us. I have 5 daughters and 8 granddaughters. And the one thing that I worry about for them more than anything else is their health. I want to know, when I see those little kids, the youngest of my grandchildren, I like to see their happy faces. I like to see them feeling good. And if one of my daughters or my son says so-and-so has a cold and this one fell and broke something, that's my worry for the day. That's the way it is. So I want them to have doctors making decisions, not some employer who has a self-righteous moral view that he wants to impose on my daughter, my granddaughter, my wife. I don't want Republican politicians making decisions about my family's health care, nor yours, or even those who are on the other side. On our side of the aisle, we believe that women are capable of making their own health care decisions. And that's why President Obama is trying hard to make contraception more affordable, because he knows it's basic health care for women. And almost all women of age have used birth control at some point in their lives, and yet many have to struggle to pay for it. And we ought to applaud President Obama for trying to make it more affordable. He wants women. He believes that they're capable of making their own decisions, and he wants them to be healthy. His proposal respects the right of religious organizations that don't wish their birth control to provide birth control to their employees. Under the President's plan, women who work for religious organizations don't have to go through their employer to get affordable contraception. These women will be able to get it directly from their insurance company, and I think it's a reasonable compromise. But some of our Republican colleagues refuse to recognize this. Listen to what the other side's saying. You don't hear the Republicans talking about empowering women or giving them more opportunities. No. The GOP agenda is about denying benefits, restricting access, taking away options. Mr. President, we weren't sent here to intrude in the lives of fellow citizens or to drag women back to the dark ages. We're sent here to offer people options, not obstacles. So I urge your colleagues, reject this amendment, hold your head high, and say to your family, to your female members, your daughters, your wife, your sisters, your mother, we want you to be healthy. That's our prime thing in life. Turn this amendment down, I ask you. I yield the floor.
Senator from New Jersey.
I have 6 unanimous consent requests for committees to meet during today's session of the Senate. They have the approval of the majority and the minority leaders, and I ask unanimous consent that these requests be agreed to and that the requests be printed in the record.
Without objection. Senator from Utah is recognized.
Mr. President, very shortly we will be voting on the amendment filed by my colleague from Missouri, Senator Blunt, the Respect for Rights of Conscience Act. I'm a co-sponsor of this amendment, and I think we ought to all be co-sponsors of it. Many of my colleagues have supported it as well, and for good reason. It provides statutory protection for one of our deepest constitutional commitments, the right to free exercise of religion. It is an effort to fulfill our oath to protect and defend the Constitution. It is an effort to put the enduring constitutional rights of the American people first over any fleeting and controversial political interests. In my view, those who support this amendment have been unjustly criticized over the past few days. And they've been unjustly criticized on a political basis, not really on an intellectual basis. Unable to win this debate through a fair criticism of the amendment, it has been mischaracterized and misrepresented. Opponents are desperate to distract the public from one simple fact. This amendment is necessary because of Obamacare, the health care law that manifests new threats to personal liberty and individual rights with each passing week. It is an indictment of the President's signature domestic achievement and all of those who supported it. Obamacare took over and regulated the nation's health care sector, 1/6 of the American economy. It stripped individuals and employers of their rights to go without coverage and the right to determine what type of coverage they would have. Obamacare is what has brought us here today. The health care law requires that women's preventive services, including sterilization and access to abortion-inducing drugs, be included in health care coverage beginning in 2012. This is a questionable policy in and of itself. Like the rest of Obamacare, it assumes that the government is able to provide all good things to the American people through a simple mandate with no consequences for cost or access. The problems with this mandate were compounded, however, when the administration, deferring to its feminist allies, determined that the mandate would apply to religious citizens and institutions. To their credit, these institutions, which are compelled by this regulation to violate their moral beliefs, announced that they would not comply with this unjust law. They refused to roll over and allow the government to force them to provide sterilizations and abortion-inducing drugs to their employees. Religions should have a right to do that because of their own moral interpretations of religious life. They stood as a witness for constitutional liberty, the free exercise of religion, and against an administration that put base partisan politics above our beloved Constitution. The President's self-proclaimed compromise does absolutely nothing to minimize the constitutional problems with this mandate. The Department of Health and Human Services never consulted with the Department of Justice about the constitutionality of this mandate. And it shows, and that's why we're here today, to undo just some of the damage to liberty and our Constitution wrought by Obamacare. All of the misleading arguments regarding this amendment run square into one simple fact. Obamacare only became law in 2010. There was no federal mandate for these services prior to 2010, and the regulations had not yet gone into effect. In other words, nobody is taking anything away from anybody. But to hear the other side talk, you would think that the co-sponsors of this amendment and the groups that support it are committed to a monstrous deprivation of women's rights. With due respect, that is absolute hogwash. I appreciate that the advocates of Obamacare might be embarrassed by this episode, but we are not going to let them get away with a gross misrepresentation of what we are trying to do here. Prior to 2010 and the partisan passage of Obamacare, access to contraceptives was abundant, and nobody advocated that the federal government involve itself in those personal moral decisions or force people to be involved, religious people, if you will. After 2010, access to contraceptives remained abundant, with nobody advocating for restrictions on their access. Here's all that changed in the meantime. In 2010, Obamacare mandated that health coverage includes sterilizations, abortion-inducing drugs, and contraceptive coverage. And as a result, religious institutions and persons will now be compelled by the state to violate their conscience, compelled by the federal government to violate their conscience. And it isn't just the Catholic Church. It's many, many churches that feel just the same way as the Catholic Church does. It's a moral and religious issue that should not be interfered with by the federal government. Prior to 2010 and the passage of Obamacare, the First Amendment was intact. Today, the First Amendment is in tatters. The Democrats who passed this law know this to be true, and they have to distract and confuse. They claim that Senator Blunt's amendment is overbroad. They claim that religious institutions and individuals would be exempt, or would exempt critical health services such as blood transfusions and psychiatric care from health plans. The Senate Democratic Steering Committee claims that 20.4 million women now receiving coverage for preventive services would lose that coverage under this amendment. Absolutely nothing, absolutely none of this is accurate. Again, all this amendment does is restore the pre-Obamacare status quo. All it does is restore the religious liberties and constitutional freedoms that existed prior to this government takeover of our nation's health care system. It restores the conscience protections that existed for all Americans for the past 220 years. If this amendment passes, here are a few things that do not change. State mandates for health coverage will remain in place. Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, forbidding discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin in employment benefits, remains in place. The Pregnancy Discrimination Act, requiring health plans to cover pregnancy, childbirth, and related conditions, remains in place. The Americans with Disabilities Act, a bill that I worked very hard to pass and was a prime sponsor of, prohibiting discriminatory withholding of health care and other benefits from people with HIV or other disabilities, remains in place. And the Mental Health Parity Act of 2008, requiring equitable coverage of mental illness, remains in place. I played a role in every one of those. Prior to Obamacare, very few people excluded any of the services that Democrats are pointing at in their efforts to scare the American people. And few will do so should the Blunt Amendment pass. But our Constitution demands that those individuals and institutions that object to providing these services on religious and moral grounds be protected. That's what the Constitution demands. It's the First Amendment. It's the first mention in the First Amendment. Even though the individuals and institutions protected by our amendment are a minority, it is that minority that our First Amendment exists to protect. The rule agreed to by President Obama would force religious organizations to violate their moral convictions. Now, this cannot be allowed to stand. I call on my colleagues on the other side to wake up and realize what they're doing here. There's only so much politics that should be played around here. And this is an issue we shouldn't be playing politics on. It involves religious freedom and liberty. And there was a time when a regulation of this sort would not have been countenanced by this body. let alone some of the arguments that have been made on the other side, trying to obscure it and make a political thing out of this. I've had the good fortune of representing the people of Utah for many, many years. It has been an honor for me, and in that time, I have seen many good people on both sides of the aisle serve well in the Senate. And one thing we could always be sure of was that when it came to our first freedoms, in particular the freedom to practice one's religion, without interference from the state, Republicans and Democrats would join together in the defense of religious rights and liberty. Why are we not joining together here? Yet under this administration, our Bill of Rights has been subordinated to President Obama's desire to micromanage the nation's health care system. It was not always this way. When the Senate considered President Clinton's health care law, itself an attempt at a sweeping takeover of the nation's health care system, giants like Daniel Patrick Moynihan, with whom I've served, a Democrat and colleague who served as the chairman of the Finance Committee, stood up for broad conscience protections like the one we're considering today in the Blunt Amendment. I worked closely with many of my Democratic colleagues in passing the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. I was the author of that bill. We passed it here. It overwhelmingly passed. I was there when President Clinton signed it into law, on the lawn behind the White House. And a lot of religious leaders were there, and a lot of liberals and conservatives were there, very happy to pass that law. But apparently those days of bipartisanship are laid to rest, and they're long past. Today the administration ignores the dear and clear dictates of the First Amendment and the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. Obamacare is unconstitutional to its core, a threat to the liberties announced and protected by our Declaration of Independence. This mandate is just one more example of how the law restricts personal liberty. It will force religious persons and institutions to violate their beliefs or pay a fine. Defending this disaster at a town hall meeting recently, one Democratic member of the House of Representatives told her constituents that they were, quote, not looking into the Constitution, unquote, when they supported this mandate. No kidding. Our founding fathers fought a revolution to prevent this type of tyranny. And that's what it is. This is tyranny. It is the political bullying of a religious group in the views of the President's allies unpopular religious beliefs. And so for political reasons, the religious groups who differ with this are being pushed around. The media, polite society, and the administration are picking on religious freedom and on religious people. Democrats like to claim that they stand up for the little guy. Not in this case. In this case, the little guy is being pushed around by the state. And I, for one, am not going to stand for it. This is discrimination masquerading as compassion, and I'm going to fight it. My oath of office, an oath to protect the Constitution, compels me to do this. I am putting the administration on notice. I'm not done with you, and my colleagues are not done with you. Whatever happens with this vote today, you are going to be held to account for your actions. We're going to get to the bottom of how this happened, and ultimately, I am confident that justice will prevail. I just hope enough of my colleagues realize how important this is. It's a fundamental set of freedoms that we've always protected. And nobody was being deprived of the so-called health care that is involved here. And ultimately, I am confident that justice will prevail. I commend my colleague from Missouri and all of the members who have spoken out for this amendment. It is reasonable, it is just, and I urge all of my colleagues to vote for it. The American people understand that this amendment is necessary because of Obamacare, and they know who is responsible for this monstrosity. I expect that they will look favorably on those who stand up for the First Amendment today and attempt to correct their folly by restoring the conscience protections that pre-existed Obamacare. And the reaction to those who stand by this historic deprivation of First Amendment rights, only time's going to tell. Let me close by just saying there are very few things that get me worked up as much as I am about this. I feel very deeply about a lot of things, but that First Amendment to me means everything. And for the President to say, well, we'll just require the insurance companies to provide this. Give me a break. A lot of the Catholic functions are self-insured by the Catholic Church, and that's true of other churches as well. The fact of the matter is, it's no solution whatsoever. And it was something that didn't need this type of intrusion because people had access to these various drugs that some are concerned about here today. And nobody on our side, it seems to me, fails to realize that religious commitment is important. Religious beliefs are important. The First Amendment is important. The free exercise of religion is important. And that's what's involved here. My gosh, to hear these arguments that this is all about contraception, my gosh, that's not what it's about. It's about the right of people with religious beliefs to practice their religion unmolested by government. I want to commend the distinguished senator from Missouri. You know, it takes guts to stand up on these issues when they're so distorted by some on the other side. I'd be ashamed to make some of the arguments that were made on this issue. Why do you think, and I just single out the Catholic Church, which is the largest congregation in our country. They're not going to abide by these laws because their religious beliefs are more important than what we want to impose on them, ignoring their religious freedoms. I'm 100% with them. When we start going down this road, let me tell you, beware, beware. That's when tyranny really begins. It's the religious commitments of our nation that has made it the greatest nation in the world. And I've got to tell you, those of you who vote against this amendment are playing with fire. Those of you who vote against this amendment are ignoring the Constitution. Those of you who vote against this amendment are wrong.